Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Emotionally Effective Leader with Catherine de la Poer. My name is Natasha Ellis-Knight and I work here at Netigate. And before we get started, and I hand you over to Catherine, here she is, I am going to go through a very quick introduction and a few points about today's webinar. Okay, so first of all, welcome to those of you who are familiar with Netigate. But for those of you who maybe aren't and are coming to us for the first time, watching one of our webinars for the first time, I just want to give you a very quick summary about who we are and what we do here at Netigate. So we are a global software as a service company, and we help other businesses to collect feedback from their customers, from their employees, from their markets, and from potential markets as well. And the way we do that is we have an online cloud-based survey feedback solution where you can create your own surveys, whether from scratch or using our templates that are crafted by our in-house experts. You can distribute them via the platform as well, and you can do that via link, SMS, email, etc. And you can also analyze the data that you collect and report on it via the platform as well. And then alongside our cloud-based platform, we also have the in-house teams of experts that I mentioned. So these are people who are experts in customer experience, in employee experience, in market research, etc. And they help our customers to plan their feedback processes. So, you know, what kind of questions do you want to ask? What are you actually trying to find out? What are you going to do with the data when you actually get it? And then how can you actually put those insights into good use? That's how our consultants help you. So that's Netigate in a nutshell. So back to today's webinar then. We have an hour scheduled, and we do have time at the end of the webinar where Catherine will take some of your questions. So I would like you to please, we both invite you to type your questions in the chat box that you can find to the right-hand side of your screen. You can either send it to everybody, you can see it in the little drop down there, or you can send it privately to me, and then we can take a look at the end of the webinar, or towards the end. Also, there will be a couple of interactive polls during the webinar, and they will also appear in this column, this window on the right-hand side. So please look out for those and let us know what you think when you see them. And then finally, from me, obviously, Netigate, we are in the business of feedback. So after today's webinar, I will be sending you a link to a survey where you can let us know what you thought about today's webinar. And we would really appreciate that. So that's all from me. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Catherine.
Natasha, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine and I'm a business coach. But I haven't always been a business coach. And in many ways, I like to think of myself as a digital anthropologist. I very much work with clients at the intersection of technology, digitization, organizational culture, and human performance. And I am particularly interested in human agility and human resilience. I've spent a huge amount of my career before I became a coach in the media industry, leading sales and business development teams for startups and scale-up businesses. And for those of you who are agency-side recruiters, I think I saw a few of you registered for this particular webinar. Hello, because I've also sat in your seat, in the hot seat of recruitment. It's not an easy job, but it's also incredibly fulfilling. My talk today really is about a superpower that we all possess, and that superpower is emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is a muscle. And unless you work that muscle, you won't develop it. For those of you who choose to develop that muscle, you firstly will end up earning more money. Yes, I probably have pricked up your ears at this point, but also people who have good levels of emotional intelligence, but specifically who are emotionally effective leaders, are generally more successful in life and at work. I just wanted to take a moment to pose this question, and something that we're seeking to answer through this webinar is what exactly is the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional effectiveness? And that's what we're going to seek to answer together by the end of this webinar. So my first question to you is, if I can get this slide moving on, why do humans have emotions? I did actually study anthropology as an undergraduate at Durham University many, many years ago. So Charles Darwin and Darwin's Origin of Species is a book that I'm very, very familiar with. Humans have emotions for survival. It's as simple as that. Your emotions, my emotions, the emotions of other people that we work with are signals. They alert us to danger. And it's a highly adaptive system developed over thousands and thousands of years. And when we were Stone Age men and women, it was there to help us to stop being eaten by, for example, saber-toothed tigers. This same fight or flight response, otherwise known as the amygdala hijack, can also be triggered when our view of the world is challenged. I'm talking about the tsunami that is technology, that is digitization, and how that is impacting on all of our lives. My message to you today, and this is, I hope, the core takeaway from this webinar, is all of our ability to survive, and in particular thrive, in a digital world, in a world that is going through and facing a global pandemic, in a world that is facing climate crisis, and a massive differentiation in terms of rich and poor through our societies and globally. It's fundamentally linked to our ability to become emotionally effective, to dial up our emotional intelligence. Emotional effectiveness simply means the ability to be agile, to flex and adapt to change. A little glance at the agenda for today. I wanted to start at the bottom of this list, this idea of now is not the moment to follow the herd. And we will be looking at, my opinion, obviously, in terms of the make or break emotional intelligence trait that I think should really drive action. And in fact, it already is. I saw an announcement on LinkedIn today about Dropbox now being the first virtual company. So they will no longer have a footprint of offices around the world. They are going completely virtual. They're not following the herd. They're doing their own thing. Who else did their own thing? Let's think about it. Salesforce took the decision, a difficult decision, to equal the pay of men and women in their organization. Another trailblazer. A third example I want to give you of an organization who is not following the herd is an organization called Gravity Payments in the US, whose boss, whose founder, went from a 33 times pay gap to a 4 times pay gap. Yes, he took a huge salary drop, and he instigated a minimum wage of $70,000 US through his company. These are the decisions that trailblazers, that organizations, that leaders for the 21st century are making. We're also going to be looking at the really critical importance of emotional self-awareness and this idea of balancing risk and empathy. We're going to look at why emotional intelligence is important, and I'm going to be introducing you to something called the Leadership Effectiveness Framework. But I really wanted to start by defining 21st century leadership in a VUCA world. And if you haven't heard of the term VUCA, it simply stands for 4 words. V for volatile, U for uncertainty, C for complex, and A for ambiguous. And I think it's probably true that we are certainly feeling that at the moment. And I picked this picture from the internet because in many ways I think it sums up what we are dealing with here. this sense of overwhelm, this sense of uncertainty, this sense of confusion, and for some of us, a real sense of anxiety about our futures. And the big takeaway for me from this picture is that fear trumps logic. So our ability to think clearly is ultimately sabotaged when we go into fear mode. If we have an inability to control our thoughts and emotions, unfortunately, bad behavior, a version of ourselves that we probably don't want to display to the world, comes to life. This is taken from Deloitte's Human Capital Trend Survey from last year, but actually the change isn't hugely dramatic through to 2020. The ability to lead through complexity and ambiguity, yes, this is a future requirement, a current requirement, in fact, for leadership. We're all experiencing managing on a remote basis at the moment because of the pandemic. We are increasingly, because of automation, artificial intelligence, big data, we're managing workforces that are combining human and machines. And speed is the new currency. We're having to move much, much quicker than we ever had to do in the past. But the one thing that I really wanted to pick out from this slide that I think is really interesting is this idea of the ability to lead through influence. And I was having a flick through Deloitte's 2020 survey this week, and something stood out for me that I thought was very relevant to HR practitioners on this webinar and also talent practitioners. It's this idea that actually HR's influence is moving from just being functionally focused, even from being organizationally focused, to being need to be seen on a global stage. That your influence as HR leaders and talent leaders needs to be seen at an ecosystem level now. And that's all about being role models for agility, role models for adapting, role models for change. So let's have a think about what that might look like. And I just really wanted for all of you to take a moment to reflect on this Leadership 2020 scorecard that came from a really interesting article from MIT. And it really looks at the requirements for what all of us now need to be thinking about and how we need to be acting, the core capabilities and competencies of leading in the 21st century. I just really want you to kind of give yourself a mental score between 1 and 5 across these 5 factors. 1, strongly agree, strongly disagree, 5, strongly agree. So there's a total score of 25. Are you somebody who is really good at building great teams? First question. Do you fully understand the implications of technology on your function and on your business? And it's a nice, easy way to think about this is ABC, understanding artificial intelligence, understanding the impact of big data, and understanding the impact of cloud technology on what you do. Can you adapt to speed? Can you move fast? Can you move at the pace that business is now moving? Can you concurrently operate at a high level, at a C-suite level, but also at a low level? And the final piece is this piece around building trusted relationships. I'm fascinated by trust. Trust is a psychological state, in fact, and it means that oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter which exists in the brain, is present. Oxytocin is otherwise known as the love hormone, and it only exists when you have real trust in the person that you're with. It is particularly present, for example, when women give birth, and it's very much part of one human bonding to another human. And Stephen R. Covey is the son of the famous Stephen Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of highly effective people. And he is known for have written this book, The Speed of Trust. And his position, and I have to say I agree with it, is that the first job of a leader is to inspire trust. So actually, if you think about it, the role of leaders is to change the neurological makeup of the human brain, the person in front of you, through intentionally building trusted relationships. So I want you to think about this, and I wanted to run a quick poll, if I may, on trust factors, and just thinking about something for you to take away with you. What is it? What is it that really drives trust? And Paul Zak famously wrote a book called Trust Factors, and he looked at the actions that humans can take that have a dramatic impact on the level of oxytocin in the brain. So what are you all thinking across these factors? Very interesting poll result coming through. I'm just pausing as you all take part in this poll. There's some shifts going on. Thank you very much for taking part. We're going to give you another sort of 30 seconds just to make sure everyone has had their vote. We're just going to, I think it's so interesting how so many of you are voting three particular questions, three particular categories at a very, very similar level. So I think we're going to end the poll here. Thank you so much for taking part. In terms of the scores, the answer to the question is, in fact, intentionally building relationships with other humans. And Paul Zak talks about care, caring for other humans, kindness for other humans. This ability for us to connect in a meaningful way with one another is the thing that drives levels of oxytocin in the brain. So that's just something to bear in mind. And it's not something that you can circumnavigate. It takes effort to build trusted relationships with other people. So thank you for taking part in that little poll. We have a second poll coming up. But I wanted to, I think of all the slides that I have in my deck, this is probably the one that I really want to spend some time on because it tells many, many stories. The primary reason that this picture on the left-hand side of the slide was developed was really to showcase the mindset shifts for organizational transformation around digitization. But there's so much more going on here, and it completely and utterly maps to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the emotional drivers that we have, the motivation, the intrinsic motivation that exists in all of us to become the best version of ourselves. And I'm going to start at the top of this little diagram because we are definitely seeing a shift away from a primary profit focus to more of a purpose focus. And the mindset shift that is required here is this idea of investor, this idea of stewardship. And if we take it a little bit further, this idea that actually we own nothing in this world, that we are simply custodians for the next generation. I like to think of this in terms of the 3 Ps. Profit clearly is incredibly important. You won't have successful companies if you don't have profit. But the profit now is being balanced against the impact of companies across people, society, and planet. So the environmental cost of business. Because we are such a connected world now, and because structure is giving way to networks, we can't afford to have waterfall, top-down, controlling leadership anymore. The focus now needs to be around connection, human connection, building trusted human relationships. On the point of control, power and control, this is very much the way that organizations would work. If you think back to the Industrial Revolution, if you think back to our history in manufacturing, this is now giving way to this idea of line management hierarchies, is giving way to empowerment. And this very much maps to autonomy and the fact that people want to have autonomy over the way that they work, in terms of the type of work that they do, in terms of the hours that they work. If you entrust people with autonomy, you will see the best versions of them. But we need to get our head around this idea, this paradigm that we have had in place up until now, which is hierarchy and control and profit. So this is taking a lot of brain power to make that move. And the last one is moving to this idea of 18-month, 2-year planning cycles towards experimenting. This idea of humans have this amazing will to create. And it's actually, again, in our DNA to be curious, to explore, to experiment. And this shift is incredibly important in terms of high performance from your teams and from individuals in your organizations. The last one is also a really interesting one, moving away from privacy towards transparency. And again, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the emotional needs that all humans have, at the top of that pyramid is self-actualization, which is the purpose piece. We also want to feel that we belong. We want to feel that we're accepted. That's the network piece, the building trusted relationships. We want autonomy. We want to be given rope so that we can produce and we have power over our futures. That's the autonomy piece, the empowering piece. We like to experiment. We have a huge capacity for creativity, for experimentation, for curiosity. That's the experimentation piece. And then the last piece, transparency, is about justice. It's about fairness. We all seek that. And in fact, very interesting study that I read recently was about workplace conflict, primarily linked with this perceived unfairness, this injustice, and that in itself being linked with anxiety and other mental health disorders. So this is a really important map. We always knew that digital transformation, that digitization was nothing at all to do with technology. Technology is simply the thing that powers this tremendous change, but actually it's all about humans. It's all about our emotional needs, and it's all about how we can inspire humans through their natural inclination to be sentient beings, to be emotional creatures. So let's think a little bit about emotional intelligence and what it is. For those of you who don't know, emotional intelligence is probably 3 things. It's this idea of being able to manage yourself, so self-management. And what that means is the ability to process emotions and thoughts, to make sense of those things. The second thing is the ability to manage relationships with other people and to understand other people's emotions. And then the third element is around managing change. And there are 15 traits. I use a model called the EQI 2.0, which is an NHS product. What's really interesting about this model is that all of the 15 traits are interrelated. So, for example, if we look at empathy, empathy is driven largely by our will to serve others, to be in service to others, to belong, to be accepted. And yet there is a tension between that and our will to have autonomy, which is independence, which exists in a self-expression quadrant. So we have a tension across this model between some of these traits, independence and empathy, which is a very natural tension between humans in terms of just how we grew up, and the will to be part of a family, part of a family structure, to belong to something, but also a need for independence to be our own unique human being. Another example of this would be the tension between stress tolerance, stress management, which is in the stress management quadrant, and our ability to recognize and process emotions, which is emotional self-awareness, which is in the self-perception quadrant. So all of these are interrelated. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the competencies that emerge from this model. And there are 4 of them, and they are hugely relevant to leadership in the 21st century. And the first is about being an authentic leader, a role model for trust and transparency. We've already seen the importance, the neurological, the brain chemistry importance of engaging in trusted relationships. So that's one really important thing, authenticity. And as humans, we can very easily suss people out when they are inauthentic. So authentic role models for trust and transparency is the first competency. The second is the competency of coaching. So this is this idea of moving away from a directive style of leadership, which, let's face it, we all grew up with, when you have this belief in hierarchy, when you have this belief in control style leadership and management. Coaching is actually almost the opposite of that. It's the belief that the person in front of you has the answer to their question, and that by asking powerful questions and by listening really, really well, you can help them to unlock the answer rather than telling them the answer. And this is a second really, really important competency of emotionally effective leadership. The last 2 are around innovation. So the ability to innovate at speed. And actually what this is all about is your relationship with risk. Again, this tension between risk-taking on the one hand, innovating, sometimes when we don't have all of the information, and this idea of empathy, where we want to feel like we're fitting in, that we're part of this tribe, this group. There's an enormous tension between those 2 things. Acceptance on the one hand, and having the moral courage, if you like, to step up and do what you think is the right thing to do. And the third is this idea of vision, a visionary style of leadership, that you can paint a picture, an amazing narrative, that you can create hope, that you can paint the picture of a hopeful future to your team, to your colleague, to your workforce. This is what motivates people. What we grew up with, what I certainly grew up with as an anthropologist, was this idea that, a quick dopamine hit, a quick reward, an extrinsic reward, a pay rise, gym membership, all of these things were quite enough. In fact, what we now know about the human brain, what we now understand, is the driver of human motivation and engagement is actually very, very different to that. That we are we engage through our emotions, through our thoughts and our emotions. And in a sense, this diagram comes down to 3 motivating factors that you will all be very, very familiar with. And those are that we are motivated by hope, we are motivated by faith, and we are motivated by love. And this doesn't change just because we're at work. We certainly don't leave our emotions at the door when we get to the office. So what are the implications for emotional intelligence? Well, I think the first thing I wanted to kind of bring to your attention is that emotions contain data. They are signals, and emotions can be managed. And we can use these emotions to influence both ourselves and others. Daniel Goleman famously wrote the book, Emotional Intelligence. I do highly recommend that book to all the leaders that I work with, because 90% of emotional effectiveness, of great leadership, is associated with high levels of emotional intelligence across those 15 traits, across those 4 competencies. And that actually 67% of our abilities essential for effective performance are emotional. Remember, we are driven by love, faith, and hope. So what derails us? What detracts us from being the best version of ourselves? And unfortunately, it is the way that we evolved as humans, and that I go back to that survival mechanism that we all have. This fear response, this amygdala hijack that happens when we perceive that we are being threatened in some shape or form. And unfortunately, the brain confuses itself. There's an activating event, something happens to us, does something to us, and the brain perceives a threat. And unfortunately, what happens is that we then give up any sense of logic, and we move into this very, very powerful survival response, which is and has been, in fact, been beautifully illustrated in a book called The Chimp Paradox. Literally, the chimp within us wakes up. And this fear response typically takes on 4 guises. Some of us will want to fight, some of us will want to run away, some of us will freeze, and some of us will deflect. We will almost go into sort of a victim modality. And there's a huge amount of neurobiology that sits behind this fear response, which is why it is so powerful. And there are 2 hormones, neurotransmitters, that come into play when we have a fear response to an external stimulus. Cortisol, which is a stress hormone, floods into our bloodstream, and levels of testosterone rise in the blood. And unfortunately, that has a massive impact on our ability to think clearly. We can't actually make very effective decisions when we are in stress mode. We tend to think in black and white, which is what's called binary thinking. And what happens is that we prejudge. We go into what is called a protective mode. So I really wanted to help all of us now on this webinar to distinguish really clearly between survival mode, which is when all of this happens, and the neurobiology of our brain changes so that our ability to think well, to make good decisions, our ability to form relationships with other people is compromised. All of this happens obviously in a nanosecond, and it's our ability to very, very quickly move from this stress response into competency mode. That is the difference between knowing about emotional intelligence and being emotionally effective. This is a leadership effectiveness framework that I really wanted to introduce you to all today, and it's a very simple framework, and it's borrowed from cognitive behavioral therapy. And if we were to sum it up in a very quick, snappy 3 words, this is how human brains work. It's this idea of the way we think impacts the way we feel. Our emotions impacts the way that we show up. So think, feel, do. Think, feel, do. So what influences the way we think are our core values and beliefs. We then have a set of emotions that are influenced by the way we think. And just as an example of this, so if we have a positive thought, positive mental attitude, that generally will stream into positive emotions and positive actions, positive outcomes. The opposite of that obviously is negative thinking, creates negative emotions, creates negative outcomes, negative actions, negative influence. This influence piece is all down to how we control our thoughts and actions. This is the painful truth, unfortunately, of about humans. We judge ourselves by our intentions, and we judge others by their actions. We are not particularly adept at judging ourselves based on our behaviours. And to a certain extent, you can understand why that would be. We can't see ourselves. We can't sort of go outside of our bodies and look back on how we are responding to certain situations, to certain events that are happening to us. And a big part of that, unfortunately, is to do with bias, confirmation. That's called confirmation bias. We have unfortunately a tendency to favour information that props up our own beliefs about ourselves around a sort of fixed identity. But I have something to tell you, which perhaps you're not aware of. All of our behaviour is contextual. And in fact, there are many versions of us. And depending on the context that we find ourselves in, different versions of ourselves will come to the fore. And if I just give you a very simple example of that, we can think about perhaps some of the different ways that we behave at home in kind of contexts around our friends versus how we show up, how we behave when we are in a more professional working environment. So I kind of really wanted to test this idea of how often we ask others for feedback, because actually asking other people feedback about how we are showing up is in many ways the one positive action that we can all take to get a better view of how we are showing up. So let's have a think. Let's have a look at what you think about this feedback piece. I'm going to give you another minute or so just so that we get a really good cross-section of opinion here. I give you another 10 seconds and then we can end the poll and I can share the results. I'm not actually sure if you guys can see the results, but just in case you can't, I will share them with you. So how often do you ask others for feedback about how you're showing up? So I'm going to end the poll now. I hope you've all had a chance to vote. And this is really interesting, but actually not highly surprising. So I never ask for feedback came in at 9%. The largest proportion of you say that you occasionally ask for feedback. 29% of you said sometimes and 18% often. So well done to the 18% of you. Keep asking for feedback. It's a really, really important part of challenging the assumptions that we have about ourselves. And unfortunately, because of confirmation bias, we often do. So I want to link this back to this idea of the importance of self-awareness. Because self-awareness is ultimately linked with how we process and manage our emotions. And I think there are really three takeaways from this webinar that I just really want you to consider. And the first is this idea of asking for feedback. It's a really good way to grow our level of self-awareness. So let's define what we mean by self-awareness. And what I mean by self-awareness is this ability to see ourselves really clearly, to have clarity on who we are and how we are behaving, how we are showing up, influence that we have on the world. So self-awareness is a really important building block. It's probably the foundational block for becoming an emotionally effective leader. And And we must take time to reflect on and manage how we are showing up. And feedback is a really good way to do that. And it doesn't have to be a big fanfare. It doesn't have to be an annual survey. It can be very, very simple. And it can be done every single day, every single week. And it really involves 2 questions. And the first question that I encourage all leaders to ask is, what is the one thing that you value most about me? Ask that question. I think there is a real opportunity for us to celebrate our strengths and lead with our strengths. And the second question, I really recommend you writing these 2 questions down. The second question to ask is, what is the one thing that I can change for my own benefit? So those are the 2 questions. What do you value most about me? And what is the one thing that I can change for my own benefit? Remember, knowledge is power. I want to look at this idea of saying no. It's a curious one, perhaps. You might be wondering why I've included that. Saying no is actually about saying yes to time for reflection, for time for meditation, for mindfulness, for quiet reflection. This idea of making the time and the space for yourself to reflect on your inner thoughts and your feelings. Only by doing that can you make sense of them, can you process them. So this is really important in a world that is moving very, very fast, and where often the focus is very much on execution, where the focus is very much on task. But I really encourage you to, every single day, put some time in your diary to reflect, to meditate, to take a walk, just to dial into that inner dialogue, the narrative that informs the way that we behave and show up. And then the last one is coaching. Coaching is another really, really effective way to help all of us to think out loud. I've invested in coaching for myself for many, many years, and it's been an incredibly useful thing to do. And again, this isn't necessarily about paying for coaching services. This is actually about creating a coaching culture within your business where you help each other to think well. And that's about asking really great questions and listening really, really effectively. Those listening skills are very, very important. So that's about self-awareness, because greater self-awareness leads to greater self-management, so the management of thoughts and emotions. The second piece of the puzzle is about relationships with other people. And contrary to popular belief, and this is really interesting, I was reflecting on some of the mental models that I was brought up with. And I reflect on something that my dad used to say a lot in our family. And this was this idea of man is wolf to man, which is a famous Hobbes quote from, I think it was the 19th century. This idea that actually we are just, if it wasn't for civilization, we would just all be killing each other effectively, that we all want to be top dog. In fact, the subsequent research into humans and how we operate is that we're naturally very caring individuals, that actually kindness and care and empathy is what is the natural way of being. So your capacity for seeing or experiencing another situation from their perspective really lets you grasp the emotional dimensions of a business situation. What I'm saying to you here is ignore human emotions at your peril. Let's reflect on the idea of what it is that workforce engagement, what does that really mean? What does it look like? It's not about external rewards. It's not about money. It's not about gym membership. It's actually about, do I feel accepted? Do I feel loved? Do I feel trusted? Do I have autonomy to do the job that I want to do well? Do I have choice in this? Do I feel significant? Do I have a sense of importance over what I'm doing? This is this idea of mastery, being really good at something. And do I have purpose in my life? Is there a hopeful future in terms of the organization that I'm working for and who I am as a person and what I'm doing with my life? And then this idea comes from a really great book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. And it's a fantastic read, very simple, really great case studies. And it's based on a number of organizations, the likes of Google and Dropbox and those types of fast growth, exponential growth companies. And it's how and why are they so successful? It's because they really understood what motivates people. And these are skills. These are skills that we can all learn. And the first one is about trust and connection, which we've talked about a lot. It's intentionally building relationships with other human beings to build this idea of psychological safety. It's about being vulnerable. Steve Jobs was very famously known to show up in meetings and start the meetings by saying, "This is a really dopey idea." He wanted to disarm the people around him. He wanted to make this connection with his team on a very human level, because when we do that, when we share our own vulnerability, our own shortcomings, it has a transformational effect on how the brains of you and your colleagues can work, and it opens the door for creativity and innovation. And the third piece is around purpose, the why, the North Star, the why are we doing this? Another really, really important part. If we look back on that orange slide, people, planet, profit, the three sitting alongside each other. This is what matters to people. The emerging leadership behaviours are these, and it means a very, very different approach to leadership. This idea of top-down hierarchies where ego mattered, it's becoming less and less the case. What is emerging is this idea of servant leadership, of humility. What is also emerging is this idea of, we've seen it, the movements around diversity and inclusion, around Black Lives Matter, that actually we are not, yes, competition is important. We like to compete, we like to challenge, but not at the expense of belonging, that actually cooperation is equally important to us, that belonging is equally important to us. It's not about being smart anymore. It's not about the IQ, because we don't know everything anymore. There's a lot of not knowing. So we need to be in this learning frame of mind, this curiosity frame of mind. And again, moving from being a rock star to being a mentor, creating a kind of coaching culture within the organization where listening becomes really important as opposed to directing. So we set out at the beginning of this talk to say, complacency is your biggest risk. Staying as you are is the biggest risk. And there's a famous quote around the most expensive 7 words in organizational history, which are, "This is how we've always done it." This is how we've always done it isn't going to get you where you want to go. So this idea of agility, adapting, flexing to a new set of circumstances, to a new context, becomes incredibly important, and no more so actually than in the financial markets. This idea of environmental social governance is really taking hold within investment communities, and interestingly now how financial institutions are looking at the way that organizations are treating their workers, their employees. This is actually dramatically starting to influence how investment decisions are being made. It's what's called impact investing. Apart from the environmental impact, which is clearly incredibly important, one of the areas that I'm very interested in is this, as I'm sure you guys are as well, is this idea of human health and well-being. And this piece around the S of ESG. And I wonder if at some point in the future, that the value of organizations may in fact be hung on two things, clearly in addition to the profit piece, this idea of organizational resilience, and second of all, the idea of workforce resilience. This is really a picture of employee experience, and it's this idea that as humans, the way that we work within our physical workspace, modes of working are very, very different. In fact, I think that the latest stat on focus is that we are only able to focus for a couple of hours a day. But actually, we really enjoy collaborating, we enjoy learning, and we want to socialize. This is how we operate. And so the physical workspace becomes really, really important, as is the culture piece. And I'm bringing you back 70% of culture, what it feels like to work around here, is owned by leaders. And that includes HR and talent leaders leading from the front. So this idea of safe, psychological safety, trust and transparency, belonging, purpose. We know where we're going. We have a North Star, and giving people autonomy. And I think there's obviously a dramatic inflection point in terms of what's happening with COVID, in terms of we've been forced as leaders into a position where we are having to entrust our teams and our workforce. And then the technology piece is also important. This comes from another piece from Deloitte Insights. There is fear in the workplace around, will a robot take my job? Technology needs to be harnessed for the benefit of humans, and we have a choice in this. There are ethical arguments, and we need to make sure that we step up and take control in these conversations around human-centered design and the fact that we are putting humans and our own ability to thrive with artificial intelligence, with big data, with cloud technology. These are important conversations that all of us should be involved with. Workforce resilience, of course, is about creating a workforce where we can have really good mental, emotional, and physical fitness. I like to think about it, and this is not a new idea, this idea of the corporate athlete, that in fact the only way that you're going to see the best versions of your workforce is if they are mentally, emotionally, and physically fit. So therefore, if you work them so hard, if their levels of stress are too high, if their level of work is too enormous, you're not going to see the best from your workforce. They will not be able to execute and perform at the level that you want them to. So what does it mean to be emotionally effective? This is the question that we set out to ask at the start of this webinar. And it comes down to one thing. It comes down to influence. It's not good enough to know and think, yes, emotional intelligence, I know it's important. It's actually about closing the knowing doing gap. It's about taking micro actions and that starts with one thing. It starts with emotional self-awareness. My final thoughts to all of you on this topic is that saying no, asking for feedback, and creating thinking partnerships within your organizations are the things to do, the actionable things that you can take away from this talk, which will help to increase your level of emotional self-awareness. That's the first thing. This idea of, gig economy and less contracted, full-time contracted workforce is a reality. So therefore, what is it that we need to create in order for this very different makeup of workforce to continue to be engaged? It's actually about creating emotional contracts with people. And that is about embedding purpose into work. And then from a talent sourcing perspective, it's about aligning the purpose of talent with the purpose of organizations. These are conversations to have when you are hiring people. These are very, very interesting conversations. And the third thing that I think is really interesting, and it actually is something that was in Daniel Coyle's book, The Culture Code, is that the word culture derives from the Latin cultus, which means care, caring for something. And I think if there's one thing that I would wish for you to take away from this webinar, it is simply that our ability to connect, to be kind, to care for one another is not a weakness. It is an enormous strength and something to focus on in terms of the actions that we take, because it is kindness and connection which fires up trust, which fires up outstanding human performance. There's one more book. I'm a coach, I'm allowed to recommend books. I do an enormous amount of reading and reflection in terms of the job that I do, but there's a fantastic book called Insight, which is actually a kind of go-to manual for helping you to think about this area of self-awareness. And it's by Tasha Eurich. She's an American professor. And this is, I think, my top tip for all of you. If you do nothing else, please do this. Stop thinking. Introspection, I think some people steer away from because you end up sometimes in these very dark tunnels. She says, stop asking why questions. Why me? Why am I having these emotions? Why am I having these traumas in my life? But rather ask the question, what? For clarity about yourself. The ability for all of us to think clearly is actually asking that very simple question, changing the why to what. What's important to me? What can I do to demonstrate that I am the best person for this job? What is my impact on others? And what can I do to ensure I have a positive influence on those people around me? The impact that I leave on this world can be positive or negative, and that's a choice. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate all of you joining us today, and now is the opportunity, if you would like to ask some questions.
Yeah, so we only have a few. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a brilliant presentation, and you've probably seen all the comments, the great comments you've had in the chat. We have a few more minutes left. If you'd like to pick a question to answer. We have one from James, or one further down from Katie. Should we take a look at Katie's, Catherine? Or
could you read it to me? Because otherwise I'm going to...
Yes, of course.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Can harmony ever exist between the high EQ person and a low EQ person?
Oh my goodness, that is such an interesting question. Can harmony ever exist? I mean, I think the answer has to be yes. Because the high EQ person perhaps can forgive the low EQ person and help them to develop their EQ. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but I think it's about, as if we go back to this idea of the think, feel, do, it's just, we all have our flaws. And as I said earlier, and I do these tests with leaders all the time, and many leaders, they do self-assessments on, and they believe that they have a high emotional intelligence, and this comes out in the reporting. But actually, when people give them 360 feedback, often the picture is very, very different. And that is the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional effectiveness. So I think we are very, very bad at evaluating ourselves. We do need external feedback. We do need to kind of turn to the people that we trust, in order to get a visual on ourselves and how we are showing up. So I don't know if I've answered that question, but it's a good question. I like it.
Thank you, Catherine. We do have another one very quickly. We have 1 minute left. Let's see, James. Okay, James asked, how do you think we might create thinking partnerships with teams in a virtual world?
Oh my goodness, love that question. I mean, this idea of thinking partnerships comes from an amazing book called by a lady called Nancy Klein. And in fact, this was the first book that I ever read when I became a coach, when I was training to be a coach. And really opened up my mind, because I remember thinking there was a visual when I was training to be a coach about the difference between mentors and coaches, and very much this idea of a sliding scale of tell and listening. So mentors typically are people who are maybe 5, 10, 15 years ahead of you in your career, and you go to them and they act as a sounding board, but actually there is an opportunity for them to say, look, this is how I've done it. So there's much more of a tell relationship, whereas thinking partnership starts with a very, very simple question, which is, what do you want to think about today? And Nancy Klein talks about her mother at the beginning of this book, and the powerful relationship, the power of listening. And she reflects on growing up as a girl. I think Nancy's herself an American, in America, where, and I always have this picture in my head where she said her mother would sit opposite her when Nancy came to her with a sort of question. You know, she had some confusion about something in her life, and that her mother would just sit very, very still and would draw up her legs on the sofa and just say, talk to me, tell me what's going on in your life. And that act of just being present and listening. And to James's question about virtual, that we can absolutely connect virtually. Look, we're doing it now, and we can create spaces for people to think well, even if it has to be done via these type of channels, that we can still be there for people, that we can still listen, and we can still listen well. And I think this idea of not being interrupted, we have this, I think, assumption always that we are going to be interrupted. And actually what happens when we believe we're going to be interrupted is that we're simply listening inside our heads in order for us to come back with some kind of clever answer, some witticism, some wisdom that we can almost compete with each other. This is about this move away from, we're not competing with each other anymore. Yes, we are here to challenge others, but this is a sort of mental mode, a change in mindset away from competition towards cooperation. It's really difficult to do that, but actually creating these moments in our days where we can simply listen to another human being, and engage with that person and be still and be silent is incredibly powerful. I hope that's answered your question, James.
Thank you, Catherine. I wonder whether we should take the last question and then call it a day. How would you feel about that? But for anyone that needs to go, then please feel free. Does that sound
Absolutely.
Okay? Perfect. Okay, Astrid.
Perfect. Thank you.
Do you have any guidelines on how to test candidates for EI in the recruitment process, aside from psychometric tests?
Oh my goodness. Do you know what, Astrid? That is such a great question. I think self-awareness is an area to look at, to explore, and clearly there will be some really great questions that come out of this, and I think for me it's the ability for somebody to showcase their openness to having their mind changed, actually, that they because I think, you know, this idea of sort of being in entrenched positions, unfortunately, is a signature style for people who have the opposite of an agile mindset. They're simply sort of stuck in the mud, that they cannot move beyond their mental modes. So I think something around almost like a competency-based interview question that can really get under the skin of somebody's level of self-awareness, almost telling a story around, this is a time when I thought that, and then this happened, and then I came out the other end, and they were able to change the way they thought about something based on, new perspectives, new information, rather than just sticking in a rigid way to this is the way we've always done things around here. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I think that I always look for is, and again we come back to that same thing about around listening. Are they a good listener? And sometimes we need to create the space in interviews to allow. There's always a sell, right, to a candidate in interviews. So I think that there's a real opportunity to give the candidate the opportunity to demonstrate their ability to listen well. And perhaps there are some questions around that could be really interesting. So yeah, I think two things then: listening and the ability to have the openness to have one's mind changed, rather than so moving from the why to the what. I hope that makes sense. And a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think we will call it a day there. A brilliant presentation. Thank you to everyone who watched today as well. I hope you enjoyed it. Look out for the follow-up email where you will get a replay. So the slides will be there. You'll be able to watch this again, share it. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Over and out.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.